They called him the Indian tracker like it was a joke, like he was some relic from the Old West dropped into a modern war. The German tank crews heard the rumor through interrogated prisoners. The Americans had an Apache reading the land like a book, predicting where panzers would roll before the engines even started. In the officer's tent of Kampfgruppe Vogel, Oberleutnant Dietrich Vogel himself laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. An Indian, he said, against German engineering and tactical doctrine. Unteroffizier Erwin Kessler, his gunner, made jokes about tomahawks versus steel armor. But on the night of November 12, 1944, somewhere in the fog-choked forests of eastern France, 4 Panzer IVs and a command half-track vanished from every map, every radio frequency, every planned coordinate. The Germans spent 3 days searching. What they found wasn't wreckage in the place they expected. It was something far worse. Proof that the man they mocked had rewritten the rules of armored warfare with nothing but mud, instinct, and patience. Thomas Neshoba didn't look like the soldiers around him, and he didn't move like them either. While the other men of the 45th Infantry Division stomped through the Vosges Mountains with regulation boots and standard-issue confidence, Thomas walked differently, heel-toe, weight distributed, eyes scanning not just ahead but down, reading the earth itself. He was 28 years old, born on Apache land in Arizona, raised hunting mule deer in terrain where one wrong step could mean a broken ankle or a lost trail. His childhood had been spent in 2 worlds, the reservation where his grandfather taught him the old ways, and the government school where teachers tried to beat the Apache out of him, cut his hair, forbid his language, make him into something more acceptable to white America. He'd learned to navigate both worlds, to code switch between cultures, to keep the knowledge that mattered close to his chest while presenting a face that wouldn't threaten the men who held power over his life. It was exhausting, lonely work, but it had prepared him for the army in ways the recruiters never understood. When the war broke out, Thomas had been working as a hunting guide in the mountains outside Flagstaff, taking rich tourists from Phoenix and Los Angeles into the backcountry to shoot elk and feel like frontiersmen for a week. The pay was decent, the work kept him outdoors, and most importantly, it kept him away from the reservation where opportunities were scarce, and the weight of poverty and federal control pressed down like a physical thing. He'd registered for the draft in 1942, expecting to be called up eventually, but when the notice came in early 1943, it still felt surreal. The same government that had confined his people, stolen their land, tried to erase their culture, now wanted him to fight for it. His grandfather, ancient and weathered, had looked at the draft notice for a long time before speaking. "Our people have always been warriors," the old man said in Apache, his voice like wind through dry grass. "This is not their war, but it is still war, and war is where a man proves what he is. Go, fight, survive. Come back and teach your sons what I taught you." Thomas had enlisted the next day. Basic training at Fort Bliss, Texas, had been a study in contradiction. The Army wanted to turn him into a standardized soldier, interchangeable with every other man in the unit, but it also couldn't quite figure out what to do with the skills he already had. When the drill instructors ran land navigation exercises, Thomas finished in half the expected time, reading terrain features that weren't on the maps, finding routes that the course designers hadn't anticipated. When they practiced tracking and patrol techniques, Thomas pointed out signs the instructors themselves had missed. A boot print in soft ground that was 3 hours old based on how the edges had dried, a broken branch that indicated someone had passed through moving fast and careless, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in a depression where the wind couldn't disperse it. At first, the instructors thought he was guessing or showing off. Then they started testing him, setting up scenarios, hiding men in the brush and asking Thomas to find them. He found them every time. By the end of basic, Thomas had been flagged for specialized training, assigned to a reconnaissance course, and eventually attached to combat units heading to Europe as what the paperwork vaguely called a scout and tracker. The Army had done this before, quietly and without much publicity. Native American soldiers with hunting and tracking backgrounds had been used in similar roles in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific, their skills proving invaluable in terrain where conventional reconnaissance often failed. The Navajo code talkers got the headlines, their unbreakable language used for radio communication across the Pacific theater, but there were hundreds of other native soldiers doing quieter, equally essential work, reading trails, predicting enemy movements, navigating without maps, surviving in conditions that broke other men. The Army didn't advertise this much, partly because it complicated the narrative of technological and cultural superiority the war effort promoted, and partly because many commanders simply didn't know what to do with soldiers who operated outside standard doctrine. Thomas had learned early to keep his head down, do the work, and let the results speak for themselves. It was the same strategy he'd used his whole life. He'd shipped out to Europe in July 1944, landed in Normandy 6 weeks after D-Day, and been assigned to the 45th Infantry Division as it pushed inland through France. The division had a reputation for toughness, having fought through Sicily and Italy before the invasion, and its men were veterans who'd seen enough combat to respect competence and distrust pretense. Thomas fit in by not trying to fit in. He did his job, kept his opinions to himself, and slowly earned the kind of grudging respect that comes from being useful when it matters. By October, as the division entered the Vosges Mountains and the fighting turned into a grinding, muddy nightmare of contested forests and fortified villages, Thomas had been attached to Captain Thaddeus Merrick's reconnaissance company, and that's where everything changed. Captain Thaddeus Merrick was 34 years old, a West Point graduate who'd spent the pre-war years teaching tactics at Fort Benning and dreaming of combat command. He'd gotten his wish in 1943, been shipped to Italy, and learned the hard way that war was messier, more chaotic, and far less glorious than the textbook suggested. He was a competent officer, not brilliant but solid, the kind of man who followed doctrine because it gave him a framework to operate within when everything else was chaos. He was also, though he wouldn't have admitted it, deeply uncomfortable with anything that didn't fit his understanding of how soldiers should be. When Thomas Neshoba was assigned to his company with orders to utilize his specialized skills in reconnaissance and tracking, Merrick's first instinct was to file him away as a curiosity and forget about him. The Army was full of experiments and special programs that sounded good on paper and accomplished nothing in practice. Merrick had no reason to think this would be different. The first time Thomas demonstrated what he could do, Merrick didn't believe it. They were camped in a half-destroyed village called Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, 10 miles from the German lines, and the morning patrol had reported tire tracks on a muddy logging road heading east. Merrick studied the tracks with binoculars, declared them at least a day old, and ordered the patrol to move on. Thomas, standing quietly at the edge of the group, said 3 words. 6 hours, heading northeast. Merrick turned slowly, his expression somewhere between irritation and disbelief. Thomas knelt beside the tracks, touched the edge where the mud had dried, crumbled a piece between his fingers, then pointed at a sapling bent near the road. Truck brushed this going fast. Sap's still wet. Rain stopped at dawn. Mud's got morning frost in the shade, but not the sun. They passed after sunrise, moving supplies, probably, maybe troops. Sergeant Frank Morrison, a veteran of the North African campaign with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too much, crouched down beside Thomas and studied the same tracks. Morrison had been in the Army since 1940, had fought at Kasserine Pass and Anzio, and he'd learned to recognize competence when he saw it, no matter where it came from. After a long silence, Morrison looked up at Merrick and said, "He's right, sir. I can see it now that he's pointed it out." Merrick said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He didn't like being corrected, especially in front of his men, but he also wasn't stupid enough to ignore information that might save lives. The patrol followed the trail. 6 miles up, they found a hastily abandoned German supply depot, still warm, cigarettes stubbed out in the last 20 minutes, crates of ammunition and rations stacked under camouflage netting. They captured 2 soldiers who hadn't run fast enough and recovered a map case with defensive positions marked in pencil. Intelligence that division command later used to plan an artillery strike. Merrick didn't thank Thomas, but he didn't dismiss him again either. Over the following weeks, he began to use Thomas more deliberately, sending him ahead of patrols, asking him to read terrain and predict routes, slowly learning to trust information that came from observation and instinct rather than maps and radios. It was an uncomfortable education for a man who'd built his career on doctrine, but Merrick was pragmatic enough to adapt. The war didn't care about his comfort, and neither did the Germans. Sergeant Frank Morrison became Thomas's unlikely ally in those early weeks. Morrison was 31, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania who'd joined the Army to escape the mines and found himself in a different kind of hell, the grinding, endless combat of the Mediterranean theater, where men died for nameless hills and forgotten villages. where the enemy was skilled and determined, and where survival was a matter of luck as much as skill. Morrison had seen enough war to know that the official way of doing things was often wrong, that the men who survived were the ones who adapted, who learned from everyone including the enemy, who checked their egos at the door and focused on staying alive. He recognized something in Thomas that the other men missed, not exotic mysticism or Hollywood Indian magic, but hard-won expertise, the kind that came from a lifetime of paying attention. Morrison made it his business to run interference for Thomas, to translate his observations into language the other soldiers understood, to quietly make sure that Thomas's advice was heard and acted on. It was Morrison who started calling Thomas Grey Wolf, a nickname that stuck because it sounded better than the Indian and gave Thomas an identity the men could relate to. Thomas tolerated it because it was better than the alternatives, and because Morrison meant well. As autumn turned colder and the Allied advance crept toward the German border, the nature of the fighting changed. The Wehrmacht was retreating, but not in chaos. They were pulling back to prepared positions, using the terrain to bleed the Americans at every river, every ridge, every crossroads. And increasingly, they were using their panzers not in mass formations like the early war, but in small mobile packets. A few tanks, a half-track, some infantry, slipping through the forests at night to hit supply lines, disrupt advances, vanish before air support could arrive. These Kampfgruppen battle groups were brutally effective. They knew the roads, had the maps, and their tank commanders were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd survived the meat grinder of Russia and learned to think like predators. The Americans were losing trucks, losing men, losing time. Division Command wanted answers. Where were the Germans staging? Which routes were they using? How could they be intercepted? Merrick's company was tasked with finding out, and for the first time, Merrick turned to Thomas without hesitation and said, "You're up." Thomas spent 3 days walking the roads alone, sometimes a mile ahead of American lines, sometimes in the gray zone where neither side held ground, the no man's land where patrols clashed in brief, vicious firefights and disappeared back into the trees. He moved through the forest like he was part of it, avoiding the obvious trails, watching for signs most men would never see: broken branches at tank height, track marks half hidden under leaves, oil stains on stone where a Panzer had idled, the smell of diesel lingering in a hollow where the wind didn't reach. He found a pattern. The Germans were using old forestry roads, paths that didn't appear on military maps because they'd been cut decades ago for logging, abandoned when the trees were gone, overgrown but still passable for a tank if you knew they existed. These roads connected the German staging areas to the American supply routes in ways that bypassed the obvious approach routes, the ones that were watched and mined and covered by artillery. The Germans had clearly studied the terrain carefully, probably using local guides or captured French maps, and they'd identified routes that gave them maximum concealment and flexibility. But Thomas realized something else, something the Germans hadn't counted on. They were creatures of habit. They moved at night, yes, but they moved at specific times when the American patrols rotated, when the moon was down, when the fog was thickest. And they always took the path of least resistance, the route that kept them hidden longest even if it added miles. It was smart tactics, the kind that kept them alive against superior Allied air power and artillery, but it also made them predictable if you knew what to look for. Thomas walked those routes, memorized every turn, every choke point, every place where the road narrowed or crossed a stream or climbed a ridge. He studied the terrain the way his grandfather had taught him to study game trails, not just where the path went, but why it went there, what made it attractive, what made it safe. And then he found the perfect place, a stretch of forest road that curved through a ravine, steep hills on both sides, trees so thick overhead that even daylight barely reached the ground, a stone bridge just wide enough for one tank at a time crossing a stream that had cut deep into the bedrock over centuries. If a column entered that ravine, they'd be blind, deaf, and boxed in. The lead vehicle would be on the bridge, the rear vehicle still approaching, and the middle vehicles would have nowhere to maneuver. It was a natural kill zone, the kind of terrain that every ambush predator dreams of. Thomas marked it on his map with a simple X and walked back to camp. When Thomas laid the map on Merrick's field table and explained what he'd found, Merrick stared at it for a long time. Sergeant Morrison was there along with 2 other officers. Lieutenant Baxter, young and eager, fresh from officer candidate school and still learning that war wasn't like the training films, and Lieutenant Kowalski, a grizzled former enlisted man who'd been battlefield commissioned in Italy and trusted his gut more than his rank. They all studied the terrain, the approach routes, the kill zone Thomas had identified. Baxter asked the obvious question, "How do you know they'll use this road?" Thomas tapped the map with a calloused finger. "Because every other route is watched now or mined or too close to our artillery range. This is the only path that keeps them hidden all the way to our supply depot at Rayon. And they need to hit Rayon. They're running low on fuel. I found siphon marks at 2 of their staging areas, saw where they'd drained wrecked vehicles and hidden the cans. They're desperate, and desperate men take risks, but they take calculated risks. This road is their best option." Merrick looked up, his expression unreadable. "You're betting lives on mud and broken branches." Thomas met his eyes without flinching. "I'm betting lives on knowing how a hunter thinks, and right now, sir, they're the hunters. We just need to be there first." Merrick was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once. "We set the trap." The plan was simple, brutal, and required perfect timing. Merrick's company would move into position in the ravine under cover of darkness, set up a crossfire with bazookas, machine guns, and daisy-chained anti-tank mines on the bridge. They'd let the German column enter, let them commit fully to the ravine with no easy way to retreat, then cut off the escape route and destroy them vehicle by vehicle. No radios once in position. Radio silence was total to avoid detection by German signals intelligence. No fires, no lights, no movement that might give away their presence. They'd wait as long as it took, days if necessary. If Thomas was wrong, they'd have wasted time and effort, exposed themselves to potential counterattack and accomplished nothing. If he was right, they'd eliminate a major threat and send a message that the forests weren't safe for Panzers anymore. Morrison pulled Thomas aside before they moved out and asked him quietly, the kind of question one veteran asks another, "You sure about this?" Thomas checked his rifle, his face unreadable in the fading light. "I'm sure they'll come. Whether we're ready is up to us." They moved into the ravine on the night of November 10, 1944, 70 men in total, carrying weapons, mines, and enough ammunition to fight for an hour if things went wrong. Thomas led them down paths he'd scouted, avoiding the main road entirely, using deer trails and dry stream beds to approach the position without leaving tracks that German patrols might spot. It took 4 hours to reach the kill zone, moving slowly and carefully, every man understanding that noise discipline was life or death. By midnight, the trap was set. Anti-tank mines daisy-chained on the bridge with pressure triggers set to detonate when the first vehicle crossed. Bazooka teams positioned in the rocks on both sides of the ravine with overlapping fields of fire, machine guns covering the approach and exit routes, riflemen in the trees ready to cut down infantry. Merrick positioned himself with Thomas on the high ground overlooking the kill zone, binoculars ready, waiting. The first night, nothing happened. The men stayed silent, motionless, eating cold rations, watching the road, fighting the cold and the boredom and the creeping doubt that maybe this was a waste of time. The second night, the fog rolled in exactly as Thomas had predicted, thick and cold, turning the forest into a gray void where visibility dropped to 20 feet. And at 0200 hours they heard it, the low, grinding rumble of engines, the metallic clink of treads on stone, the hiss of hydraulics as turrets traversed. Thomas touched Merrick's arm and pointed. Through the fog, shadows moved, massive and slow. Panzers. Oberleutnant Dietrich Vogel was in the lead half-track, studying his map by shielded flashlight, confident in his route and his crew. At 29, Vogel was a veteran of the Eastern Front, having commanded tanks through the brutal campaigns of 1943 and early 1944, before being transferred west after his unit was mauled in the fighting around Minsk. He'd seen the best and worst of the war, the early victories when German armor seemed unstoppable, and the grinding defeats when Soviet tanks outnumbered them 10-1, and the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. He'd survived by being smart, aggressive, and ruthless, by learning to read terrain and exploit weaknesses, by moving fast and hitting hard before the enemy could react. Behind him, 4 Panzer IV medium tanks followed in single file, engines throttled low to reduce noise, commanders buttoned up inside their turrets to avoid the cold. Vogel's Kampfgruppe had been operating behind American lines for 2 weeks, hitting convoys, destroying supply dumps, disappearing back into the forest before Allied fighter bombers could be called in. It was dangerous work, but it was also the kind of mobile, aggressive warfare that Vogel excelled at, the kind that felt like the old days when German armor ruled the battlefield. Vogel was proud of his crew, proud of his record, and utterly certain that the Americans couldn't match German tactical flexibility. He'd studied American doctrine, read captured field manuals, interrogated prisoners, and concluded that while the Americans had superior numbers and logistics, they lacked the tactical sophistication and battlefield initiative that defined the Wehrmacht. They fought by the book, relied on overwhelming firepower, and rarely improvised. It made them predictable, and predictable enemies were dead enemies. When his intelligence officer, a nervous young lieutenant named Holst, had mentioned the rumor about an Indian tracker, Vogel had laughed out loud, a genuine belly laugh that broke the tension in the cramped half-track. He'd grown up reading Karl May novels, fantasies about the American frontier written by a German who'd never left Europe, stories where Indians were noble savages with bows and feathers, living in harmony with nature and fighting doomed battles against the inevitable march of civilization. The idea that such a man could threaten a Panzer column, that primitive tracking skills could matter in an age of radio, radar, and mechanized warfare, was absurd. Vogel's gunner, Unteroffizier Erwin Kessler, had joked about it over dinner. Maybe he'll throw a spear at us, Herr Oberleutnant, or send smoke signals to warn his friends. The whole crew had laughed, the kind of dark humor that kept men sane in an insane war. Kessler was 24, a farmer's son from Bavaria, who'd been drafted in 1942 and trained as a tank gunner, serving on the Eastern Front until frostbite took 3 of his toes, and he was reassigned west. He was good at his job, with a steady hand and a sharp eye, and he'd learned to kill without thinking too much about it, because thinking led to nightmares and nightmares led to mistakes. He trusted Vogel, trusted the other crews, and trusted the Panzer IV beneath him, 50 tons of steel and firepower that had kept him alive through 2 years of hell. As they rolled through the fog into the ravine, Kessler felt nothing but calm. The road was clear, the Americans were miles away, and by dawn they'd have destroyed another supply depot and vanished again. He didn't see the mines. He didn't see the men in the rocks. He didn't see Thomas Neshoba watching him through the mist, hand raised, waiting for the last tank to enter the kill zone, counting vehicles, timing the moment with the patience of a hunter who knows that rushing the shot means losing the prey. Merrick's whisper was barely audible, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. All vehicles in? Thomas nodded once, his eyes never leaving the German column. 4 tanks, 1 half-track, approximately 40 men total. The lead half-track was on the bridge now, the 1st Panzer just behind it, the others strung out along the narrow road with nowhere to turn. Perfect. Merrick raised his own hand and 70 men held their breath, fingers on triggers waiting for the signal they'd rehearsed a dozen times. Then Merrick dropped his hand and the forest exploded. The first bazooka round hit the lead half-track dead center, the shaped charge punching through thin armor and detonating inside, turning the vehicle into a fireball that lit up the ravine like daylight and sent burning men tumbling into the road. The second and third rounds hit the rear Panzer simultaneously, one blowing the treads into twisted metal, and the other penetrating the engine compartment, turning the tank into a roaring inferno. The tanks in the middle tried to reverse, tried to turn, drivers screaming into intercom systems, commanders trying to identify targets through periscopes that showed nothing but smoke and fire. But the road was too narrow and the bridge was already disintegrating under the daisy-chained mines, pressure triggers detonating in sequence and dropping tons of stone and steel into the stream bed below, taking the lead half-track with it. Machine gun fire raked the column from both sides, tracers cutting through the fog, sparks flying off armor, infantry scrambling from the vehicles and dying in the crossfire before they could find cover. The Americans had rehearsed this, knew their sectors of fire, knew to aim low where the armor was thinnest, knew to focus on the hatches and viewports where crew might emerge. Kessler, trapped in his Panzer with the turret jammed and smoke filling the crew compartment, screamed for the driver to back up, but the tank behind was already burning, blocking the path, and the driver was dead, slumped over the controls with his head blown open by a machine gun burst that had found the vision slit. Kessler tried to open the hatch, tried to bail out, but bazooka fire bracketed the tank and he knew that stepping outside meant instant death. He huddled in the turret, ears ringing from the explosions, lungs burning from the smoke, and waited to die. Vogel, thrown from the half-track in the initial explosion, crawled into the ditch with his uniform on fire, rolled in the mud to extinguish the flames, and looked up through the smoke to see American soldiers emerging from positions he'd never suspected existed, moving with practiced efficiency, finishing off disabled vehicles with grenades and satchel charges. His last coherent thought before a rifle bullet ended his war was a single word: how? How had they known? How had they been waiting? How had every assumption, every calculation, every piece of intelligence been so catastrophically wrong? The battle lasted 11 minutes from first shot to ceasefire. When the guns fell silent and the smoke began to clear, 4 Panzer IVs were destroyed or disabled beyond repair. The half-track was burning wreckage at the bottom of the ravine, and 32 German soldiers were dead or dying. Another 8 were captured, wounded and dazed, pulled from wrecked vehicles or found hiding in the trees. Merrick's company took 6 wounded, none fatal, and 0 dead. It was the kind of lopsided victory that rarely happened in war, the kind that came from perfect intelligence, perfect positioning, and an enemy who never saw it coming. As dawn broke and the fog lifted, engineers moved in to document the site, recover intelligence from the wrecks, and clear the road for salvage operations. Medics treated the wounded on both sides, following the rules of war even as they catalogued the carnage. Thomas stood on the ridge above, watching the aftermath, saying nothing. Morrison climbed up to join him, offered a cigarette. Thomas took it, and they smoked in silence for a while, watching the sun burn through the mist. Finally, Morrison said, "Division's going to want to know how you did this." Thomas exhaled smoke, eyes on the horizon where the forest stretched away into Germany. "I just listened to the land. It tells you everything if you pay attention. The Germans were good soldiers, but they were fighting someone else's war on someone else's land. They didn't know the terrain, didn't respect it, thought their maps and their doctrine were enough. They weren't." Morrison nodded slowly, thinking about all the battles he'd fought, all the times he'd seen men die because they underestimated the enemy or overestimated themselves. "We found a diary on one of the bodies," he said quietly. "Officer wrote about the Indian tracker, called it a joke, said it was American propaganda. He's dead now." Thomas flicked ash into the wind. "Jokes don't usually win battles." Morrison smiled, grim and tired. "No, they don't." Captain Thaddeus Merrick filed his after-action report on November 14, 1944, and for the first time in his military career, he wrote a commendation that wasn't based on textbook tactics or by-the-book execution. He wrote about instinct, about knowledge that couldn't be taught in any academy, about a soldier who'd seen what others missed and turned it into victory. He recommended Thomas Nashoba for the Silver Star, citing exceptional reconnaissance skills, tactical acumen, and courage under fire that directly resulted in the destruction of enemy armor and the preservation of American lives. Division Command approved it, though the citation was carefully worded to avoid drawing too much attention. The Army still wasn't sure how to handle soldiers who didn't fit the standard narrative, who complicated the story of American technological and cultural superiority. Thomas received the medal in a quiet ceremony 3 weeks later, Merrick pinning it to his uniform in front of the assembled company, the men clapping and whistling because they knew what he'd done, knew that some of them were alive because of him. Thomas accepted the medal, said "Thank you, sir," and went back to work. There were more roads to scout, more trails to read, more battles where the old skills mattered as much as the new weapons. The story of the ambush spread through the ranks, passed from unit to unit, changing slightly with each telling but always ending the same way. The Indian tracker called the shot, and the Panzers disappeared. Some versions added details that weren't true, turned Thomas into a mythical figure who could smell Germans from a mile away, or hear tank engines through solid rock, who moved invisibly through the forest and struck like a ghost. Thomas ignored the stories, found them vaguely embarrassing because he knew the truth was simpler and harder. He'd spent a lifetime learning to see what was there, not what he expected to see, and in a war where everyone was looking at maps and radios and doctrine, that made all the difference. The Germans had laughed because they couldn't imagine that the old way still worked in a modern war, because their worldview didn't have room for the possibility that a man with Stone Age skills could defeat Iron Age technology. They'd believed their own propaganda about technological superiority, about the inferiority of non-European peoples, about the inevitability of their tactical brilliance. and that belief had killed them as surely as the mines and the bullets. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht's use of small Kampfgruppen in the Vosges region had dropped sharply. The survivors reported that the forests weren't safe anymore, that the Americans had somehow learned to predict their movements, that ambushes were waiting in places that should have been secure. German commanders reading these reports in warm headquarters far from the front didn't connect it to a single Apache tracker. They assumed the Americans had improved their intelligence network, maybe turned a collaborator, maybe broken a code, maybe gotten lucky. They never understood that the answer was a man who read tire tracks the way they read maps, who knew that predators follow patterns, who'd grown up in a culture where survival meant noticing everything and assuming nothing. Thomas Nashoba continued to serve through the end of the war, attached to various units as they pushed into Germany, always walking point, always finding the paths others missed, always bringing his men back alive when he could. He survived the Battle of the Bulge, survived the crossing of the Rhine, survived the final push into Bavaria. He was there when the war ended, standing in a destroyed German town whose name he never learned, surrounded by soldiers celebrating and crying, and trying to process the fact that they'd lived through it. Thomas returned to Arizona in the summer of 1945, took off the uniform and tried to go back to the life he'd left. It didn't work. The reservation was the same, the poverty and the federal control and the casual racism. But Thomas had changed. He'd seen the world, proven himself in the hardest test imaginable, and the idea of going back to being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than, was intolerable. He used his GI Bill benefits to buy land outside Flagstaff, started a small outfitting business, married a woman named Sarah who understood what the war had done to him, raised 2 sons and a daughter. He taught them to track, to hunt, to read the land, passing on what his grandfather had taught him. He rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, he downplayed it. Just doing my job, he'd say, nothing special. But the men who'd served with him knew better, and they stayed in touch, writing letters, visiting when they could, making sure Thomas knew that he mattered, that what he'd done mattered. Sergeant Frank Morrison, interviewed decades later for a military history project at the Army War College, was asked what made Thomas Nashoba different from other scouts. Morrison, old and gray by then with grandchildren and a quiet life in Pennsylvania, thought for a long time before answering. Most of us, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, we were taught to fight, taught to shoot, to move, to follow orders, to execute doctrine. We were trained for 6 months, maybe a year, and then we went to war. Thomas, he was taught to see, to understand, to adapt. And that teaching started when he was a child, passed down through generations, refined over centuries. It wasn't about blood or mysticism or any of that nonsense. It was about knowledge, hard-won and carefully preserved, the kind that our culture had forgotten or dismissed as primitive. In a war where everyone was blind half the time, stumbling through fog and chaos and incomplete information, the man who could see clearly, who could read the signs and predict what came next, that man won. Thomas was that man. The interviewer asked if Morrison thought Thomas's heritage made a difference, if being Apache gave him some innate advantage. Morrison shook his head firmly. It wasn't about innate anything. It was about what he'd been taught, what he'd practiced, what he knew. You could teach any man those skills if you started early enough and taught them right. But we don't. We rely on technology, on equipment, on doctrine, and we forget that war is ultimately about human beings making decisions with incomplete information under extreme stress. Thomas had tools for that, mental tools, observational tools, that the rest of us didn't. That's what made the difference. The German perspective on what happened in that ravine came to light years after the war, when historians began interviewing Wehrmacht veterans and accessing archived documents from both sides. A surviving member of Kampfgruppe Vogel, a driver named Otto Schreiber who'd been captured in the ambush with severe burns and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp, described the moment he realized they'd been outmaneuvered. "We thought we were invisible," he said in a 1978 interview, his voice still carrying the weight of that night 34 years later. "We had the best tanks, the best training, the best doctrine. We'd fought the Russians, fought the British, fought everyone, and we'd survived because we were good at what we did. And then in one night, all of it meant nothing. We rolled into that ravine thinking we owned the forest, thinking the Americans were miles away drinking coffee and reading letters from home, and we found out we were just guests, and the rent came due all at once. When asked if he'd heard about the Indian tracker before the ambush, Schreiber nodded slowly. Yes, we heard. The rumors went through the whole sector after prisoners were interrogated, and we laughed. I remember laughing. We thought it was American nonsense, propaganda, maybe even a deliberate lie to make us paranoid. We thought the war was about steel and oil and tactics, about radios and artillery and air support. We forgot it was also about dirt and patience and knowing the ground better than your enemy. The Americans had a man who knew, and we didn't take him seriously until it was too late. That was our mistake. That was the mistake that killed Vogel and Kessler and 30 other good men. The tactical lessons from the ambush were studied at Fort Benning, and later at the Army's Command and General Staff College, though Thomas's name was often omitted or reduced to a footnote in the official analyses. The studies focused on the effective use of terrain, the importance of detailed reconnaissance, the value of patience in setting an ambush, the integration of multiple weapon systems to create overlapping fields of fire. These were important lessons, doctrine that saved lives in future wars, but they missed the deeper point, that modern warfare still had room for ancient skills, that technology didn't erase the need for human judgment and hard-won knowledge, that diversity of thought and experience was a tactical advantage, not a liability. Some instructors got it, incorporated Thomas's methods into their teaching, encouraged students to think beyond the manual. Others dismissed his role as luck or exaggeration, insisted that the ambush succeeded because of superior firepower and positioning, not because of one man's tracking skills. The debate continued for decades, part of a larger conversation about what kind of soldiers the Army needed and what kind of knowledge mattered in an age of computers and precision weapons. Thomas's own view, expressed in one of the few interviews he ever gave, was characteristically modest. A local Arizona newspaper, doing a feature on Native American veterans for Veterans Day 1989, tracked him down at his home outside Flagstaff and convinced him to talk. I didn't do anything special, Thomas told the reporter, a young woman who'd never been to war and struggled to understand what he was describing. I just used what I knew. My grandfather taught me to track deer when I was 6 years old. Taught me that every animal leaves a story in the dirt, and if you can read it, you can find them, predict where they'll go, be there waiting. Tanks are just big animals that burn fuel instead of eating grass. Same principles apply. The Germans were good soldiers, brave men doing their duty, but they didn't know the land like I did. They relied on maps and doctrine, and those things are useful, but they're not enough. You have to see what's actually there, not what you think should be there. That's all it was. The reporter asked if he felt proud of what he'd done, if he considered himself a hero. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains he'd known his whole life. I feel proud that I served with good men, he said finally, and that some of them lived because I was there. That's enough. I don't need to be a hero. I just needed to do my job and come home. I did both, so I'm satisfied. The men of Merrick's company never forgot. At their reunions, held every few years until age and death thinned their ranks too much to continue, they always raised a glass to Thomas, even after he stopped attending due to failing health, even after he passed away in 1990 at the age of 74. Sergeant Morrison, who organized the reunions until his own death in 1995, made sure that every new attendee, every son or daughter or grandchild who came to hear the old stories, heard about Thomas Nashoba and what he'd done. Morrison would stand up at the dinners, glass raised, and tell the story one more time. How the Indian tracker they'd underestimated became the reason they survived. How he'd turned the tables on an enemy that thought themselves unbeatable. How he'd proved that respect is earned in the dirt and blood of real action, not given based on assumptions or stereotypes. We were lucky, Morrison would say at the end of the story, every time, his voice cracking with age and emotion. Lucky the Army sent him to us. Lucky Captain Merrick was smart enough to listen. Lucky we were smart enough to trust him. And lucky the Germans weren't smart enough to take him seriously. That luck, that combination of circumstances, saved our lives. Never forget that. The broader historical context makes Thomas's achievement even more remarkable. Native Americans served in World War II in numbers disproportionate to their population. More than 44,000 out of a total native population of less than 350,000, a higher percentage than any other ethnic group in America. They served as pilots, paratroopers, engineers, medics, and infantrymen in every theater of the war, from the frozen Aleutians to the jungles of Burma. Some, like the Navajo code talkers, became famous for their contributions, their unbreakable language helping to secure victory in the Pacific. Others, like Thomas, did their work quietly, their names lost to history, except in the memories of the men they served beside and the dusty files of unit records. They faced a bitter irony. Fighting for a country that had dispossessed their ancestors, confined them to reservations, attempted to erase their cultures through forced assimilation and boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. Yet they served with honor and courage, motivated by complex reasons: patriotism, economic necessity, a warrior tradition that predated the United States itself, a desire to prove their worth to a society that doubted it, a hope that service might lead to better treatment and recognition after the war. That hope was largely disappointed. Native American veterans returned home to find the same discrimination, the same poverty, the same federal policies that treated them as wards of the state rather than citizens. It would take decades of activism and legal challenges before conditions began to improve, before the contributions of Native veterans were properly recognized. Thomas's story is one among thousands, but it represents something essential about that generation. They did what was asked of them, did it with excellence, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to live their lives with dignity. The fact that even that modest request was often denied is a stain on American history that no amount of belated recognition can fully erase. In the decades after World War II, the U.S. military slowly, unevenly, began to recognize what it had overlooked: that soldiers from different backgrounds brought different strengths, that homogeneity was a weakness rather than a strength, that the best units were those that could draw on diverse knowledge and perspectives. The lessons were hard-learned and often forgotten, relearned painfully in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. But the fundamental truth remained constant across all those conflicts: the side that adapts, that learns, that uses every advantage, including the ones that don't fit the doctrine, is the side that wins. Thomas Neshoba understood that instinctively, didn't need a manual to tell him that a Panzer column moving at night through unfamiliar forest was vulnerable. That confidence could be a fatal flaw, that the best weapon is sometimes just knowing something your enemy doesn't. He proved it in a ravine in France on a foggy November night, and 4 German tanks vanished off the map because he saw what they couldn't imagine. The German crews who laughed at the idea of an Indian tracker made a mistake as old as warfare itself. They assumed that their way of fighting was the only way that mattered, that their experience and technology made them invincible, that the enemy was incapable of surprising them. It's the same mistake empires have made throughout history, from the Romans facing Germanic tribes to Napoleon frozen in Russia, to the Wehrmacht itself ground down by enemies they'd dismissed as inferior. They forgot that war is fundamentally about adaptation, about using what you have against what your enemy doesn't expect, about finding the seam in the armor and exploiting it ruthlessly. Thomas had something the Germans didn't expect: a lifetime of knowledge about reading terrain, predicting movement, thinking like both the hunter and the hunted. He used it with cold efficiency, and they died, never understanding what had beaten them. The lesson is simple, timeless, and perpetually ignored. Never underestimate your enemy, especially the one you don't understand. Because the moment you laugh, the moment you dismiss them as primitive or inferior or irrelevant, is the moment you've already lost. Today, if you visit the Vosges Mountains in eastern France and know where to look, you can still find the ravine where it happened. The bridge was rebuilt after the war, stronger and wider, the road repaved and incorporated into the modern highway system. The forest has regrown, the scars of battle hidden under decades of leaf litter and new growth. There's no monument, no plaque, nothing to mark the spot where Thomas Neshoba turned the tables on Kampfgruppe Vogel and proved that the old ways still mattered. Local historians know the story, have documented it in regional archives, but it's not on any tourist map or battlefield guide. Maybe that's fitting. Thomas didn't fight for monuments or recognition, didn't want his name in lights or his face on recruitment posters. He fought because it was his job, because men depended on him, because he had skills that could save lives and it would have been wrong not to use them. He used those skills with devastating effect, and he won. The Germans laughed at the Indian tracker, right up until the moment their panzers vanished off the map, swallowed by a forest that had been read, understood, and turned into a trap by a man they never saw coming and never took seriously until it was far too late. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible untold stories from World War II. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us which lesser-known hero you'd like us to cover next. History is full of warriors who changed the course of battles without ever making the headlines, and we're here to bring their stories to light. Don't miss out. Subscribe now.